at the autonomic nervous system today. Again, this is one of the divisions of the peripheral nervous system. We have the autonomic and then the somatic. So we're going to start with the autonomic, and our first objective here is to describe the two branches of the autonomic nervous system. So when you look at the overall nervous system, there's central and there's peripheral. Within the central, we talked about this in our previous on Friday. We talked about, or Monday, excuse me, we talked about the central nervous system being brain and spinal cord, and then peripheral nervous system being everything else, peripheral nerves, ganglia, etc. So here we're going to speak about the autonomic division. This is the division that's not under our voluntary control. Then we can further divide the autonomic into two branches, the sympathetic and parasympathetic, and so that's what we'll focus on here. Now, we want to think about the dual innervation of the autonomic nervous system. What does that mean? That means that all of our glands, our smooth muscle, all of our central organs, right? Think about your heart, lungs, kidneys, your gastrointestinal tract. All of those are being dually innervated. They're being innervated by the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system, and they're acting antagonistic, right? Antagonistic, almost like, evil and good twin brothers. So the parasympathetic is going to be the function that is going to be rest and digest, and then sympathetic is going to be the fight or flight. But again, don't think about them separately. Think about them both having contribution onto our major organs, but there's this comparative secrecy. And comparative secrecy means that if the sympathetic stimulation raises, parasympathetic decreases, and vice versa. All right. A good example that I like to give is the fight or flight scenario. Think about being chased. Think about a bear or an animal chasing you, or being scared. Let's say you have a really big exam that you're not prepared for. Those types of flight or fight or freeze, which is another sympathetic response, those types of events are going to elicit a predominance of the sympathetic, and then the parasympathetic will be decreased. Parasympathetic doesn't go away, but its influence will be toned down in those states. And the opposite is true. After you've had a large meal, if you're resting, while you're digesting food, your sympathetic tones down, your parasympathetic tones up. So that's the comparative secrecy. Now, this is going to manage many unconscious processes that are essential for homeostasis: blood pressure, body temperature. All of the variables that we discussed earlier, those are going to be regulated, and the unconscious processes, such as being alert, awake, those types of processes will be regulated with the autonomic nervous system as well. Okay, so it's essential to make the connection that homeostasis cannot be maintained without this division of the nervous system. This is how we raise blood pressure, for example, when the sympathetic stimulation increases to the heart. So here's a nice visual of the autonomic nervous system. Here's the sympathetic division, and then here's the parasympathetic. So this is just a schematic to show you the nerves that are targeting the central organs here, right? All of our smooth muscle and glands that are in the middle. So the influence coming from the sympathetic system arises at a different spot in the spinal cord than the parasympathetic. So for the sympathetic, those fibers arise from T1 to L2. So in our spinal cord, we have several spinal nerves that are exiting, right? One at each level. And so the spinal nerves exiting at level T1, thoracic 1, to lumbar 2, those are carrying sympathetic signals on these fibers. They're going to synapse on the sympathetic chain, or at least some of them are, and then they're going to go out to the target organs here in the middle. Others will synapse to other ganglia that are not a part of the synapse sympathetic chain. We call these collateral ganglia. And then others will go to the adrenal medulla, which we will speak about. So this is the sympathetic route. Okay, we go from the T1 to L2, and then 3 different options for the synapse before it gets to the central target organs. On the parasympathetic side, it's a different location. It's going to be the brainstem. So the brainstem, which includes the medulla, the pons, and the fibers of the parasympathetic system are going to arise here. They're going to travel out to ganglia that are close to their target organ, as opposed to ganglia that are far away on the sympathetic side. So the parasympathetic ganglia are closer to the target organs, and then there's another neuron that goes from that ganglia to the individual glands in question. We also can look at the distal portion of the spinal cord, the sacral segment, which is S2, S3, S4. That is also going to give rise to parasympathetic fibers that go to some areas of the intestines, go to the bladder and rectum, and then go to the genitalia. So the pelvic organs will get their parasympathetic innervation from the S2 to S4 segment of the spinal cord. So sympathetic T1 to L2, parasympathetic will be the brainstem, and these are cranial nerves. So all of our cranial nerves arise in the brainstem, and so a few of them, 3, 7, 9, and 10, are going to be helping to carry parasympathetic signals to the upper head and neck related organs, right? Target organs. The vagus nerve, however, is a much longer nerve. So the vagus nerve is going to go into the thorax. It's going to give branches to the heart, to the intestine as well. So vagus is one of the longest nerves in terms of the autonomics and the cranial nerve. And it's going to go from the brainstem all the way through down to the intestine. So this is just a schematic overview of the autonomic system and just looking at that comparative secrecy. So let's think about the anatomy, the makeup of these fibers. So we have two neurons in series going from the central nervous system out to the effector target organs. We have a preganglionic neuron, which goes from the CNS to the ganglia. And then we have a postganglionic neuron, which goes from the ganglia to the organ. And as we described earlier, the length of those neurons differ from sympathetic to parasympathetic, right? The distance from the ganglia to the organs differ. Now, we also want to think about the intrinsic neurons. There are also intrinsic neurons that are helping to bridge the gap and bridge the communication. But for the most part, think about our two neurons in series, preganglionic, ganglia, postganglionic. And what's a ganglia? Just to describe the term, a ganglia is a collection of cell bodies that's not in the central nervous system. So the central nervous system is where we have the majority of cell bodies, and then we have axons that project out into the periphery. But there can be some instances, which is a ganglia, where cell bodies reside outside of the brain or spinal cord. And that is what a ganglia is. So the autonomic ganglia is the connection between these autonomic fibers. Now, what are the target effector organs? These are going to be most of our smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glandular tissue. So glands include your salivary glands, that includes your pancreas, your liver. All of those glands will fall under the heading of the effector organs here. And then adipose, to some extent, is an effector organ as well. So this is what the anatomy looks like. Here's the CNS, brain and spinal cord. And then here is the axon going out into the PNS. Now, because we have another cell body here that's not in the CNS, this is called the ganglia. So the preganglionic neuron leaves the CNS, again, that T1 to L2 for sympathetic, and then the cranial nerves and S2 to S4 for parasympathetic. So they're going to leave the CNS at different spots depending on what division. Then they travel out to the ganglia. They make a synapse here at the autonomic ganglia, and then a postganglionic neuron arises and goes the rest of the way to the various effector organs. And these are all those organs we looked at in the middle, the bladder, the genitalia, the intestines, etc. So let's zoom in a little bit closer here and look at the sympathetic division. Look at some of the ways that it differs and the anatomy and the three routes of communication that we mentioned earlier. So the preganglionic neurons originate in the thoracolumbar segment, which we described, T1 to L2, right, thoraco and lumbar. This is going to be arising from the lateral horn or the intermediolateral cell column of the spinal cord. So this basically means that it's a specific section of the spinal cord. Okay, if you look at the cross section of a spinal cord, it's a very unique location on that cross section. Okay, quick question here. So to clarify, part of the nervous system for ganglia. Yes, that is correct. So it's a collection of cells, not cells, but cell bodies. So the soma or the cell bodies of the neurons usually are in the CNS, but when we find them collecting in the PNS, that is a ganglia. Okay, that is a ganglia. Perfect. Okay. So that is the general anatomy, the general makeup. And the differences we see here with the sympathetic nervous system is that there's a shorter preganglionic neuron, and then that goes to the sympathetic chain or to our collateral ganglia or to the adrenal medulla. And again, I'll explain those three options in just a minute. So that short preganglionic neuron leaves the spinal cord, makes a short stop to another ganglia that's nearby, and then a longer postganglionic neuron goes from that ganglia out to the rest of the target effector organs. Okay. Now, in the sympathetic system only, right? Really important to mark this. Usually students are confused that there's a sympathetic chain and a parasympathetic chain, which is not the case, right? There's only a sympathetic chain, and there is no parasympathetic chain, and there's no analogous structure on the parasympathetic side. So the ganglia that are connected from the thoracolumbar segment here, this is what forms the sympathetic chain, hence the term sympathetic chain, okay? So it's a connection of ganglia, kind of like pearls on a string, that form this chain, which can be seen grossly in the body, right? If you open up the abdominal cavity, take out the organs, right, even the thoracic cavity, you'll see the, almost like pearls on a string, you'll see the nervous structure running alongside the spinal cord, which is the sympathetic chain. So this is where the ganglia are located, and they're connected to form this chain. Okay. Now let's talk about the other two routes. So one route is to the sympathetic chain. You have a neuron arising in the thoracolumbar segment, synapses at the sympathetic chain, and then out to the effector organs. The other two options where this preganglionic neuron can synapse is one, a collateral ganglia. So this is a ganglia that's not a part of the sympathetic chain. And then two is the adrenal medulla. Now, the way that the adrenal medulla behaves is very interesting. It acts like a modified postganglionic neuron, but it's really a cell. It's a cell that's found in the center of the gland. So if you look at our adrenal glands, they're located on top of the kidneys. We have two of them, they're found bilaterally. Now, if you look more closely at the gland, at a cross section, there's an outer cortex and an inner darker staining medulla. Within the medulla, we'll find these chromaffin cells. And the chromaffin cells is where the sum of these sympathetic preganglionic neurons will synapse. Now, these cells behave just like a postganglionic neuron, but really in a cell form. Okay. In fact, some scientists took these chromaffin cells and put them in the correct growth medium, and they actually began to grow axons. So they're derived from nervous tissue. They behave like neurons, but they're really cells in the adrenal medulla. So when the preganglionic neurons synapse here, they're going to release their secretions, which are catecholamines. Catecholamines such as epinephrine, which is also called adrenaline. I'm sure you've heard that term adrenaline, like adrenaline rush, or 20% norepinephrine, and then a very small amount of dopamine. So when the synapse arrives at these chromaffin cells, they release these catecholamines into the blood, and that is another way to have a diffuse response. And if you kind of zoom out and think about this practically, if you're in a fight or flight state, if you're being chased by a bear, it's a really delayed response to have signals going from neuron to give a sympathetic diffuse response. So the adrenal medulla allows for these catecholamines, especially epinephrine, right? Especially adrenaline, which rushes into the bloodstream, and that's going to give you a quick diffuse response so that you can run away from that threat, right? You can fight or flight or freeze, and you can have the appropriate sympathetic response very quickly. So the sympathetic division is the only division that is going to use the blood as a route to have these catecholamines reach the target organs. So this is just a fast way to get these epinephrine, norepinephrine, or dopamine into the blood and to the target organs, whereas the neuron to neuron is a very slow response. So it's one of the three options, but the adrenal medulla, again, is that faster response and the more diffuse response. So here are those three options. Here's the spinal cord. And again, looking at the cross section, I just want to reiterate where these fibers arise. They arise from the lateral horn. So the spinal cord has three horns, right? It has a dorsal horn, a ventral horn, and a lateral horn. The ventral horn we'll talk about later. That's where motor fibers arise. So when you get to the somatic system, we'll talk about how fibers arise from the ventral horn. The autonomic fibers arise from the lateral horn, also called the intermediolateral cell column. So they arise here, travel out, one of the three options, sympathetic chain, then to the effector organ. Second option, a collateral ganglia, not a part of the sympathetic chain, then to the effector organ. Third option, the adrenal medulla chromaffin cells, and then hormones are released into the blood here instead of another neuron synapsing. Okay, so when we think about the fibers that arise, the preganglionic fibers, they arise from the lateral horn here, but they exit through the ventral root. Really important to make the distinction here. They're not arising from the ventral horn, they're exiting the spinal cord through the ventral root. So this is the ventral root. And there's only two routes to exit the spinal cord or to communicate to the spinal cord. There's a dorsal root and there's a ventral root. The dorsal root is bringing in sensory information. The ventral root is taking out any type of motor information. So both somatic and autonomic innervation is leaving through the ventral root, but they're arising at different horns of the spinal cord. Okay, really important. There's often confusion between ventral horn and ventral root, two different locations. So the fibers arise from the lateral horn, leave through the ventral root, and they're going to travel toward the ganglia. But as they travel here, they're going to be traveling as gray ramus fibers. Gray ramus fibers means that they're non-myelinated. So the lighter blue color here indicates non-myelinated fibers that are leaving the spinal cord and then synapse onto the ganglia. When we compare that to the postganglionic neuron, the postganglionic neuron arises at the synapse. This is the darker blue neuron here. And this is going to leave as a white ramus fiber and re-enter the spinal cord. Okay, excuse me, I think I mixed that up, sorry. Let me correct myself. So they arise as a white ramus fiber in lighter blue. They synapse at the ganglia, and then they re-enter the spinal nerve as a gray ramus fiber unmyelinated. Okay, so just a point of correction here, from spinal cord to ganglia is myelinated white ramus. From ganglia to the effector organ is the gray ramus fiber, and that is unmyelinated. Okay, just a correction there. And then the third option we mentioned is going to be the collateral ganglia, which are not a part of the sympathetic chain. Okay, let me pause here for any questions, any clarifying questions. We're going to shift gears and look at the parasympathetic division and look at some ways that it differs. Okay, so let's look at the parasympathetic anatomy. And here the preganglionic fibers, they arise from the same location, but they are coming from the CNS, so the brainstem and the sacrospinal cord. So in the sacrospinal cord, they're also coming from the lateral horn, but then in the brainstem, they're going to be arising and they're going to form the cranial nerves. So both cranial nerves and pelvic nerves are carrying preganglionic parasympathetic signals. Now, the difference here is that there's a long preganglionic neuron that goes from the CNS out to the ganglia, and then a short postganglionic neuron that goes from the ganglia to the effector organ. So there's a difference here than what we saw with the sympathetic. Sympathetic had a long preganglionic and a short postganglionic. Parasympathetic has a long preganglionic and a short postganglionic. Okay. Now looking at those cranial nerves specifically, we have cranial nerve 3, which goes to the oculomotor, which is the oculomotor nerve, goes to a ganglia nearby, and then goes to the lacrimal glands and some parts of the eye. Cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, again, arising from the brainstem, going out to ganglia that are very close to the salivary glands, right? The parotid, the submandibular, the sublingual salivary glands. And then, so we have a shorter postganglionic from the ganglia to these glands. And that's the facial nerve. The other nerve is the 9, glossopharyngeal. Glossopharyngeal arises, goes out again to ganglia that are close by, and then directly to the glands in the head and neck. And then lastly, vagus. Vagus is a specific case. Vagus arises here, but vagus innervates pretty much everything from the neck to the abdomen. It's going to innervate lungs, heart, stomach, pancreas, spleen, liver, all of your upper gastrointestinal organs, and then it's going to innervate some of your small intestine, colon as well. So your vagus nerve goes all the way down to the abdomen. So it's a really long nerve, as I mentioned, and it's going to be innervating all of the glands on the way. Now, when we look at the sacral region, the spinal nerves here, these are different from somatic spinal nerves. So when we think about the somatic nerves in the area, like the sciatic nerve, the lumbar nerves, etc., those are going to be innervating muscles of the lower extremities. But the sacral spinal nerves here, the pelvic nerves, are going to be innervating the glands and organs in the pelvic cavity. So this is S2, S3, S4 that will innervate parasympathetics to these glands. We also want to think about the mixed composition of the nerves. So as I mentioned before, we have a spinal nerve. I'm going to go back here just to look at the visual here. So here's our spinal nerve, and our spinal nerve is mixed. It has afferent fibers. Afferent fibers are going in the inward direction. They're taking in sensory information from the organs and the sensory receptors, and they're going in towards the dorsal root. So this is going to be an afferent fiber within this spinal nerve. Now, the efferent fibers within E are going in the opposite direction. They're coming through the ventral root, and they're traveling from the CNS out towards the effector organs. So they're both found in one single nerve, one spinal nerve. That is to say that a spinal nerve, which is an autonomic nerve, is mixed. It has several different fibers that are going in different directions in that single nerve. So there's a mixed composition of our autonomic nerves, right? Afferents going from the CNS, from the periphery, from the visceral receptors. This is information coming in about sound, sight, touch, taste, temperature, that goes into the CNS on afferent fibers within A. And then in the opposite direction are efferent fibers